Congressman says, no, that's not the way things work. The law of Texas is the autopsy will be performed at the hospital in Dallas.
Well, just think about what that must have been like. I mean, you have armed Secret Service agents who just lost a president of the United States. You have the president's aide, his personal physician. You have a grieving widow, and they're telling them they can't leave. They can't leave with the body.
Kenny O'Donnell called a quick huddle with the Secret Service. It was decided in the huddle that Mrs. Kennedy must be spared any further delay. O'Donnell said, "Let's go. We are getting out of here now." The judge arrived and said in a cold voice, "It's just another homicide case as far as I'm concerned." That's when we made the decision. It was physical. Us against them. I said, we're leaving."
Yeah.
The Dallas cop said to us, "Those two guys said you can't go." Then a different priest stopped the body, and it became really physical then, just pushing people aside. The priest was saying prayers, and then I just ordered him to one side. "Get the hell over!"
So behind the scenes, there's this great struggle, and there was a fight broke out, and someone pulled a gun, and there were all sorts of threats and cursing, and Jackie's standing there, and it's just a terrible scene when you listen to the guys trying to describe it.
So they form this circle around the casket, and these big, tough Secret Service agents just push their way through past a local Dallas officer. Jackie's running next to the coffin again. She never leaves. She's there with her hand on the coffin as they run down the hallway and load it onto her hearse. So they simply use their brute physical force and steal the body. Kenny O'Donnell is like, we've got to get out of here, because he thinks the Dallas police are right behind them, and they're going to pull up onto the tarmac, and they're going to surround the plane and prevent them from taking off, and they're going to get on Air Force One, they're going to board the plane and drag the body off. And he doesn't want that to happen, so they're in a panic, and they're desperate to get back to the plane, and once they're on the plane, they want to take off.
LBJ, while he's on board Air Force One, they haven't left the ground yet, decides to call Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to basically get his buy-in to a plan to have the oath administered before they leave Dallas.
Just think about how difficult and painful this phone call is for both men. Lyndon Johnson is calling his arch enemy. Robert Kennedy is stunned. I mean, he's still in a state of shock. He just found out less than a half an hour earlier that his brother was dead. And now he's talking to a man who he never accepted as vice president, a man who he despised, who is now occupying his brother's chair. And Robert Kennedy was somewhat puzzled about why Johnson would be calling him about the oath of office. Robert Kennedy doesn't know anything about the oath of office.
Johnson peppered Kennedy quite insensitively, in retrospect, with questions about who could administer the oath of office and whether it had to take a precise form and what the constitutional requirements were, and all sorts of practical questions that really didn't concern Robert Kennedy at that moment. He certainly understood that there needed to be a president of the United States, but he felt that Johnson was grabbing control much too eagerly for his taste.
So what he says to Lyndon Johnson is, let me check with the Assistant Attorney General to find out about the oath and who can administer it. While Robert Kennedy is finding out about the oath, Lyndon Johnson places more phone calls, one to the National Security Advisor. And this is the first time Lyndon Johnson's getting any information about what's taking place in the world, which is kind of shocking. You know, this is an hour and a half after the assassination. This is his first update. He's reassured that there's no evidence of any Soviet movement. There's no evidence that this is part of an international conspiracy. And while he's talking on the phone, Robert Kennedy interrupts the conversation.
How the conversation between Johnson and Bobby unfolds is a matter of some dispute. Bobby Kennedy insists that the idea for Johnson to take the oath while still in Dallas on the plane came from Johnson. Johnson implies that it was Bobby Kennedy's idea.
But again, this is Johnson, the master manipulator. He wants to pull Robert Kennedy into this whole process. He wants to be able to make the decision to take the oath in Dallas not his decision. This is RFK's decision. And for that afternoon, when the rest of the Kennedy people came to the plane, you know what Johnson said, don't you? Bobby wants me to take the oath. but it only worked against him. And it only increased the anger and the hostility between the two camps. And it was about to come to a head on Air Force One.
Most Americans, thanks to television, find out about Kennedy's being shot and pronounced dead much faster than, say, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor or even when Roosevelt died in 1945. Many people basically said they couldn't continue their regular activities over the course of that day. People went home, businesses closed. Most people, overwhelming majority of people, felt sympathy for Mrs. Kennedy and for the children especially. It was something that they could relate to almost too easily, that this was a man in middle age, clearly cut down in his prime, and that cut close to home psychologically.
At 2:14, the casket carrying President Kennedy's body arrives back at Air Force One. The Kennedy people pull up with this heavy casket, which they struggle to carry up the steps into the back door of Air Force One. The Kennedy people assumed that they would be flying back alone. The assumption was, since there were two planes in Dallas, Johnson would take one and they would take the other. This was for them going to be a private wake. Also in the group was General Godfrey McHugh, who was Kennedy's Air Force aide. He was in charge of Air Force One. And traditionally, when the president boards, the plane takes off within a few minutes. So they board the plane and realize they still think that the Dallas police are coming at them. So Kenny O'Donnell sits down, he says to McHugh, get this plane in the air.
Now, they're not aware that Lyndon Johnson is already there. Remember, they're still thinking this is Jack Kennedy's plane, not the president's plane. And so they are fully expecting that Johnson is going to get on Air Force Two, as it's called. So McHugh sends the message, let's get this show on the road or in the air, and is told by Captain Swindoll, well, we can't do that because it's not time to go yet.
So McHugh runs to the front of the plane and he confronts Swindoll and he says, what is going on? The president is on board the plane. Let's take off. We're taking off now. And he says, I can't. I have orders not to take off. Mac Kilduff has told me that there's something taking place. We're not taking off. So McHugh goes running up and down the plane. He's looking for Kilduff, who was the press secretary for the trip. And he finds him, and Kilduff says to him, we're waiting because we're going to have the oath of office administered here on the plane. So McHugh says, what do you mean? Lyndon Johnson's not on this plane. And Kilduff says, well, you go tell that 6'4" Texan back there that he's not Lyndon Johnson. And McHugh points to the coffin in the back of the plane, and he says, my president is back there in that box.
Now, unfortunately, these words reverberate through the plane, so it's possible that Johnson, certainly a lot of people hear this, and it is a moment that sort of typifies the refusal of some of the Kennedy people to transfer their loyalties so quickly to the new president. Soon enough, it's made clear that indeed Lyndon Johnson is on board the plane and that departure will have to wait until he takes the oath.
The casket was in the hall. I went in to see Mrs. Kennedy. Oh, it was a very, very hard thing to do. She made it as easy as possible. She said things like, what if I had not been there? Oh, I'm so glad I was there. I said, oh, Mrs. Kennedy, you know we never even wanted to be vice president. And now, dear God, it's come to this.
Get a sense of what this plane is like now, okay? It's dark. All the shades are shut. People are crying. The plane was suffocatingly hot. Swindoll was told to have the plane prepared to leave at a moment's notice. So he had disconnected the air supply from the ground So this plane, this aluminum canister, had been sitting in the bright sunlight for hours now without any air conditioning.
And it is hot inside. It is stifling. I mean, it's as somber and as uncomfortable a feeling as they're likely going to have.
A lot of people have now been on the plane for maybe an hour. People are sweating, it's getting uncomfortable, the plane's getting quite crowded.
And as the Kennedy people got more and more agitated, waiting with the coffin for the plane to take off, Johnson began to insist that Robert Kennedy had told him that he couldn't leave Dallas until he had taken the oath of office. And this, when Robert Kennedy found out about it, was a source of tremendous outrage.
It's clear to me that Lyndon Johnson called the Attorney General to simply get his sanction on a decision that he already made. Is there something that the Attorney General can do to deny him the presidency? He needed to take the oath. He needed to cement his position as president, do everything he needed to do, because the Kennedys might try to take it away from him.
We were waiting for the judge. First, she was to be there in 5 minutes, and then in 10 minutes. The vice president asked whether a photographer was present. Kenny O'Donnell kept saying, "We've got to go," and Lyndon Johnson kept saying, "No, I have word from the Attorney General." Aboard the plane, we found that the handle had broken off the casket while it was being loaded on the plane.
At 2:30, Judge Sarah Hughes arrives to deliver the oath of office to Lyndon Johnson.
There's no question in my mind that Lyndon Johnson wanted to be sworn in by Judge Sarah T. Hughes, an old family friend. And he was afraid somebody was going to take the thing away from him if he didn't get it quick. So anyway, I went to see Johnson get sworn in, and he said to me, "Would you ask Mrs. Kennedy to come stand here?" I said, "You can't do that. The poor little kid has had enough for one day. To sit here and hear that oath that she heard a few years ago? You just can't do that."
O'Donnell's like, absolutely not. She's been through enough today. Leave her alone. And Johnson very patiently said, "No, I think she wants to be here. Would you please go ask her?"
Johnson wants Jackie Kennedy's blessing. Jackie Kennedy was the highest profile First Lady in American history. For those who sort of saw the Kennedy image, it was both her and her husband. And so having her alongside Lyndon Johnson at the time of the oath of office was a way of symbolizing continuity with the Kennedy administration.
So O'Donnell goes back, and he's pacing back and forth because she's in the restroom. And finally, he has someone go in to ask her if she will come out. And she says, "It's the least I can do."
She was such a kind person.
She's magnanimous in this remarkably difficult moment.
So people crowd around Judge Sarah Hughes, the first woman ever to administer an oath of office. At the same time, there's also a photographer on board.
And Judge Hughes was ready to give the oath of office, and Lyndon Johnson said, "No, wait, I think Mrs. Kennedy is going to join us." And you see a series of these photographs of people mulling around. Judge Hughes is standing there, Lady Bird, Lyndon, and then you see Jackie Kennedy. The room goes quiet.
And actually, when Jackie Kennedy came out for the picture, Johnson kind of moved her over to his left. So you have Jackie Kennedy still in that pink suit, hair swept down in her eyes, face looks ashen, but still, such enormous dignity.
You see by her presence that she is effectively sanctifying this moment, as wrenching as this had to have been for her to witness the swearing in of LBJ. She's right there in that moment.
When everyone's in place, Johnson says, "Okay, we're ready." And he raises his right hand. He places his left hand on the Catholic missal. Lyndon Johnson became the first president ever to be sworn in on a Catholic missal. And there was no recording device on the plane. So Mac Kilduff is crouched down, and he's using the dictaphone that President Kennedy used to use to dictate letters. And he's using that as a microphone. And Lyndon Johnson, in a barely audible tone, recites the oath of office to become President of the United States.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute
I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
With that, the Dick DeBell recording and the photographer can leave the plane so that these images can then be sent out over the wires before Air Force One even returns to Washington. And this is really what Lyndon Johnson wanted. He wanted no delay in driving home the message that he was the new president.
And people come to Lyndon Johnson, they want to congratulate him. He just became the president of the United States, and he's reluctant. He doesn't want to make this appear like a joyous moment, because it's not. And he turns and he says, now let's get in the air. And at 2:46, just 7 minutes after Lyndon Johnson takes the oath of office, 106 minutes after John F. Kennedy is officially pronounced dead, Air Force One lifts off from Love Field in Dallas en route to Washington, D.C. And for the first time in history, Air Force One was carrying 2 American presidents. Takes off and everyone is silent for a number of minutes. They're sitting in stone silence.
And as is often the case after a crisis where everyone's rushing around, there's this subdued calm that overtakes everyone. And at this point, Johnson is finally able to reflect a little bit more, to sort of take stock of how he should proceed once he gets back to Washington.
A couple hours earlier, he had no career. It was over. Now, he's president of the United States. There's a lot of questions to be asked. There's a lot of decisions to be made.
He is sending messages to Washington, communicating what he wants to happen when he lands. There's so many details that have to be worked out.
Could we have a confirmation from AF1 stating that the commercial telephone service for the Johnson residence should be discontinued with the direct lines to our White House? Do you roger that?
How is the president's body going to be removed from the plane?
Body is in a casket, you know, and it will have to be taken by the ambulance and not by numbers.
So at one point, President Johnson turns to Lady Bird and he says, I think we should call Kennedy's mother.
Right now, Air Force One, Montiel requesting a patch with Mrs. Rose and Kennedy as soon as possible. Go ahead.
So a call is patched through to Hyannis, where the mother of President Kennedy gets on the line.
Hello? Yes, Mr. Kennedy, I have Mr. Johnson for you there. Ms. Kennedy?
Yes, Mr. President.
She calls him Mr. President. Before
How about that? You know, if you watch this correspondence, are those pilots and those corresponders saying President Johnson? Really, they're saying Mr. Johnson. They're even apprehensive to call him the president, and I'll be darned if Rose Kennedy does not have it figured out that she says to Johnson, Mr. President. Think about that.
Johnson was comfortable with the term, you know, Rose Kennedy's already calling.
I wish to God there was something that I could do, and I wanted to tell you that we were greeting with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know you love Jack and we love you.
And then Johnson really becomes emotional and breaks down and quickly gives the phone over to Lady Bird.
What surprised you about that conversation concerning Mrs. Kennedy, Rose Kennedy? Show any what? Emotion. Why? Because the family creed is Kennedys don't cry. She's very stoic in that creed of the family, which to me is really unusual. Just lost her son. He just seems like she'd have a different demeanor, but that's the way the family ran.
In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, in the first hour and a half. The general assumption is that Kennedy was killed by a radical right-winger. I mean, there had been these protests before Kennedy comes in.
But somewhere halfway between Dallas and Washington, Johnson receives word that a suspect has been arrested in Dallas for shooting a Dallas police officer. But he also matches the description of the man seen in the 6th floor of the school book depository building.
We haven't
His
got
name was
there
Lee
yet.
Harvey Oswald. The initial information about Lee Harvey Oswald was very scary for Lyndon Johnson.
The first time Oswald's name was known publicly was at 2:43 that afternoon on WBAP radio. Now, WBAP was connected with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram.
Okay, we're going to stop there because we're getting to the new stuff. Now, I do want to show you another video. I forget who asked me yesterday, I think maybe it was Callie, of what happened to Mrs. Kennedy's dress. Were you the one Callie asked me? I'm going to show you what happened to it. Not very long, but it's pretty informative. So, let's see, this is 5834. Just let me write that down right now. And we'll go back to this in a minute. We'll go back to this in a minute, but I want to show you this first. Hey, Mary, I'm sorry to make you get up again. Dad, you and Brooke Seidel took the wrong seats. Okay, anybody, where do you think the suit is? Anybody guess? Smithsonian? I think Callie said yesterday she thought it might be in the National Archives. Where else do you think that suit might be? Anybody have an idea? Library of Congress? Okay, let's find out. Here we go.